Populism attempted to create a broad coalition of interest, but it always appealed primarily to farmers, especially poor ones with only one crop and very little mechanization, very little credit. Some struggled to hold on to their land or to get it back. In other words, many populists were engaged in a type of farming that was becoming less viable in the modern age. There is also evidence that many populists were not only economically isolated, but culturally isolated as well. They felt left out of this new dazzling urban culture. Populism gave them an outlet. It should be noted who populism failed to attract. There were vigorous efforts to include labor. In fact, the Knights of Labor were at that first meeting in a labor plank calling for shorter hours, restricted immigration, and a denunciation of the use of detective agencies as strikebreakers was included in the platform. But populism never attracted large number of laborers because their economic interests were often at odds. For example, the tariff. Farmers wanted low tariffs to promote trade so other countries would buy their farm goods. Workers worked for industries that wanted high tariffs to keep the foreign goods out to employ more American workers. So on this issue, for example, they were at odds. One exception were the Rocky Mountain states, where populists did attract large numbers of miners, in part because those populists had a broader platform, and in part because of the early adoption of free silver. This concept we'll talk about tomorrow that advocated more silver currency, which obviously helped the mines, which helped the miners. Now in the South, and somewhat elsewhere, white populists struggled whether to include African Americans. By 1890, there were numerous colored farmers' alliances, including over 1.25 million members. But most white populists were interested in accepting black votes only if blacks accepted that whites would remain in complete control of society. Southern conservatives therefore attacked the populists as undermining white supremacy. Most populist leaders were members of the rural middle class, professionals, editors of newspapers, lawyers, longtime politicians. Few were themselves marginal farmers. Marginal farmers were busy trying to make a living at marginal farming. Almost all the leaders and the members of populists were Protestant. Beyond that, they varied wildly from very somber conservative Protestants to wildly semi-hysterical Pentecostal Protestants, but they were almost all Protestants. In the South especially, populism produced the first generation of what was to become an enduring political breed, the Southern demagogue. A demagogue is a person who tries to win political allegiance from the common people, misspelled from the common people with appeals to emotion and prejudice. So demagoguery is a bad thing. It's a politician playing to negative emotions to get votes. The demagogues Tom Watson of Georgia and Jeff Davis of Arkansas, not that Jeff Davis, aroused the resentment of poor Southerners against the Bourbons, against the Redeemers. Populism therefore produced a number of politicians that combined sincere idealism with brazen opportunism, sometimes in the same person. More about demagoguery and Southern demagoguery in particular later. What did populists want? The reform program of the populists was first spelled out in the Ocala Demands of 1890 and further refined in the 1892 Party Platform, People's Party Platform in Omaha. It proposed these things. First of all, a system of sub-treasuries along the lines of their cooperatives. The government would create these sub-treasuries, and farmers could deposit their commodities, let's say wheat, there. Because they couldn't sell wheat because the price was too low. They could put it in the sub-treasury, it would be stored there, and they could take out low-interest loans based on the value of the wheat, and this stockpiling of it would cause the price to rise. They also called for the abolition of national banks, these nationwide too-big-to-fail banks, because they felt they were dangerous institutions of concentrated power. They called for direct election of U.S. senators to break the power of conservative state legislatures. Recall that at this time, according to the Constitution, senators were chosen by state legislatures, not by popular vote. They called for the regulation, increasingly after 1892, outright government ownership of railroads, telephones, and telegraphs, nationalization of these industries. They wanted a government-operated system of postal savings banks. That means, for example, you go to the post office because there's one everywhere, and they could also take deposits. And this way, you could get some banking services free from the hated local banks that were privately owned. They also wanted a graduated income tax. Right now, the government's main source of revenue was tariff income, and they wanted an income tax, very common today. It had not occurred before, but they felt that this would take some of the excess wealth away from the super rich and could be used to spend for social spending. So it's a mild form of income redistribution. And finally, they wanted inflation of the currency. More about that in a minute. Eventually, this party also accepted the demand of its Western members for the monetization of silver. This would impact silver miners beneficially. Some populists were openly anti-Semitic. Hitler, by the way, is an excellent example of a demagogue. Jews equal shadowy, powerful bankers. This wasn't fair, but it was anti-Semitism was common, although not all populists were anti-Semites. Others were anti-intellectual, anti-Eastern, and anti-urban. They were against this new cosmopolitan urban culture with which they did not feel a part. But the occasional bigotry of some populists should not dominate the image of populism as a whole, which was a serious and a usually responsible movement seeking solutions to real problems. Populists rejected laissez-faire economics and the idea that rights of ownership are absolute. Populism was not a challenge to industrialization or capitalism itself, but rather a response to the brutal and chaotic way, in the populist view, that the economy was developing. Progress should continue, but should be defined by the needs of individuals and communities. Now, before I end this lecture, I want to explain something. I mentioned a minute ago that one of the things populists wanted was an inflationary policy, inflation of the currency. Now, I want to explain why this was so, because this becomes in fact, becomes the key issue in the cataclysmic election of 1896. Let's think about what inflation is for a minute. In this first box here on the top left, inflation, what's happening to prices? Well, they're going up. That's intuitive. You know that. That's what inflation is. It is, in fact, an overall rise in the price level. What's happening to the money supply inflation? It's going up too. And the value of money, however, is declining. If we're printing more money, unless the underlying value of the money, gold or the strength of the economy or whatever, is increasing proportionally as well, and it's usually not, then the value of each individual piece of money must therefore go down. This plays back into the escalation of prices. Let's say a foot-long Subway sandwich costs $5. Let's say we then double the money supply. Well, the sandwich doesn't change, but Subway is going to want $10 to get the same value for the sandwich they got before. Money supply goes up, value of money goes down, prices go up. Deflation is the exact opposite of this. Prices are going down, and the money supply is going down. But because the money supply is getting smaller, each individual piece of money is therefore increasing in value. So let's think about who likes inflation, who likes deflation. Inflation helps borrowers. They're paying back their loans with less valuable money than they borrowed. It helps farmers. Farmers like rising commodity prices. They're selling pork bellies and corn and wheat for a living. They want these things to rise in price to help them. In fact, low prices were something that were continually plaguing farmers in the Gilded Age. And finally, it just helps people without money. The value of their stuff is going to go up, and they're not being hurt by money declining in value because they don't have a lot of money. The flip side of this is that inflation hurts lenders for the same reason it helps borrowers. Lenders are getting repaid with less valuable money than they loaned. It also hurts people with money. If I have a big pile of money and we're in an inflationary time, that money is declining in value. However, if I'm a lender or a rich person, I like deflation. My money's getting more valuable, and I'm getting paid back more valuable money than I loaned out. So you can see very quickly how the powerful oligarchs in the East were fine with a policy of deflation. And for various reasons, throughout most of the Gilded Age, we were in a deflationary cycle. Farmers, borrowers, poor people, which often, and populism is a good illustration of this, were the same groups. They wanted inflation, didn't like this deflation. This is going to become a major issue. We'll talk about it more next time.